And a very good afternoon to you all, and a very, very happy St. Patrick's Day to you, wherever you are watching in the world. My name is Anthony Murphy, and since last Thursday, when it was announced that measures were being put in place to try and limit the spread of the coronavirus here in Ireland, I decided to start doing these live webcasts about Irish mythology and folklore, and, well, we'll probably delve into other topics as time goes on. It has proven to be an interesting experience so far. It's certainly taking my mind off the greater media coverage, which is wall-to-wall coverage of COVID-19. In the first episode, we chatted about the gods of the Gaels, and that was from the work of Charles Squire. Episode 2 was about the coming of Lugh in the Second Battle of Moytura and the story of the tragedy of the sons of Tuireann and the great price that Lugh extracted from them in reparation for their murder of his father Cian. In episode 3, we talked about the mysterious and shadowy character Scáthach in Alba in Scotland and her training of the warrior Cuchulainn. In episode 4, we spoke about Dagda, the chief of the Tuatha De Danann, and his connection with Newgrange or Sheedenbroga. And yesterday, we recounted the second battle of Moytura and the conclusion of the tale, which began with the coming of Lugh and how the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann battled together. In case you haven't seen that or you're not familiar with it, I will not spoil it for you. And right now I'm going to paste into the comments a link where you can see all of the previous episodes in one place, which is on the Mythical Ireland website, on the blog page at mythicalireland.com, also on the YouTube channel once the video is complete. Once the broadcast is complete, I'll leave the video on Facebook, but I also put a version of it onto the YouTube channel. Today, it being Julia Courage says another lovely storytelling. Well, I hope that's how it turns out to be. Today, it being St. Patrick's Day, we have to deal with St. Patrick. Now, I want to lay out before you some facts pertaining to my own interest in St. Patrick, and that is that I am not a scholar. I'm certainly not a scholar of St. Patrick. Haven't studied his story in depth. I do know that it's been said by more than one expert that there's a huge amount of material about St. Patrick. I think the tripartite life is the one that's quoted most often, and his own Confessio. The difficulty with St. Patrick is that a great deal of the material about him appears to be mythological in nature, appears to be folklore. And so the facts about him are quite thin on the ground. This is not at all helped by the fact that Patrick or Patricius is sometimes confused with another individual called Palladius, who was said in some sources to have been the first bishop in Ireland, I believe. Today, I'm going to stay on safe ground. I'm going to deal only with St. Patrick's arrival into the Boyne Valley and the episode, the very important episode of his story that takes place in the Boyne Valley. And I feel that that's the best way we can do things, because, to be honest, I could extend it out, but I really need to be reading this because I cannot recount everything about St. Patrick from my own knowledge and from my own experience. So if you'll forgive me that much, we can get going. I just wanted to tell you before we started, Vicky Wallace-Southall is in Oregon. And Vicky, I know you're a regular and a very good Oregon. Oh, you're in morning time there, aren't you? A very good morning to you. It's just after 5 p.m. here in Ireland. Today on RTE, on the that's the main broadcaster here in Ireland, on their website, there's a story about St. Patrick. The generally accepted account of Ireland's patron saint's life, albeit based on scant evidence, says St. Patrick was abducted from Western Britain as a teenager and forced into slavery in Ireland for 6 years, during which time he developed a strong Christian faith. Afterwards, the account continues, he escaped his captors and went back to Britain before eventually returning to Ireland as a missionary. However, research published in 2012 suggested he may well have been a tax collector for the Romans, who fled to Ireland, where he could have traded slaves to pay his way. Rather controversial. Marie Hughes, thank you, Mythical Ireland, for these stories. Best regards from Pennsylvania. Good afternoon to you, Marie, and thank you very much for joining us. I've been getting the times wrong. I keep taking 5 hours off Irish time to give the Eastern time, but it's actually only 4 hours. So I think it's 1 p.m. in Pennsylvania. Am I right? Jeff Wilson says he's very interested in this story. Okay, we'll keep reading. But Roy Fletcher, who at the time was working at the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic at Cambridge, said there were reasonable grounds to question the popular version, which is based partly on Patrick's own words in his Confessio. The problem with this account is that he was telling this story in response to accusations levelled against him that he fled to Ireland for financial gain. Dr. Fleckner, it's Fleckner, not Fletcher, Fleckner told Reuters in 2012. It's an inference that has been made long before in conventional scholarship. Judy McQueen is in Oregon. Hi, Judy, and good morning to you. Barb Jordan says, hi, happy St. Patrick's Day. A very happy St. Patrick's Day to you and all yours, and indeed to everyone watching, no matter where you are. According to the study, the saint may have wanted to leave Britain in the early 400s to avoid the onerous duties of a decurion, a Roman official responsible for collecting taxes. Interesting. Patricia is in Illinois, and it is little afternoon in Illinois. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Hello, Patricia. Thanks for joining us. Patrick's father was a decurion, and when he decided to rid himself of the post by becoming a cleric, his responsibilities would have fallen to his son. One might suggest that being a cleric is another way to earn money in certain times. But anyway, at a time when Roman government in Britain was in decline, collecting and underwriting taxes would have been an unwelcome task, enough to prompt Patrick to emigrate, Dr. Fleckner said. I will let you read the rest of that on rte.ie, the RTE website. I do not want to. I'm conscious all the time of not impinging on copyright, which is why I generally read from older works which I believe to be out of copyright, and when I read from modern works I read snippets. So I'm trying to apply what we call the fair use clause, which is that, you know, it's okay to read a certain amount or to quote a certain amount, but after that you have to be careful. Today Katie McMahon is in from Grand Rapids in Michigan. Is it Michigan or Michigan? Michigan. Very good afternoon to you, I believe, Katie. I'm trying to take the times off, the Irish time, and to make sure that I'm right. I believe Michigan is perhaps, is it 4 or 5 hours behind us? So today I'm going to read to you from a lovely retelling of St. Patrick's story, St. Patrick, his life and mission. And this was published in, I forgot to actually look that up before I started. I was busy preparing myself. 1931. And it's written by Evelyn Concannon, or as she is referred to in the published work, Mrs. Thomas Concannon. At certain times in the past, you were only important as a woman by virtue of who you were married to. Marion Wimmer is in Tyrol. I don't know where that is, Marion, but a very good day to you and happy St. Patrick's Day. Margaret Elizabeth is in Austria. Lots of love to beautiful Ireland. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and the very same to you. Warm regards to Austria from Ireland. So I'm going to read the section that pertains to the arrival of St. Patrick in the Boyne Valley. And we may be able to discuss several other bits and pieces of his mythology as we go on. Don't forget, if you have questions, pop them in as a comment, and I will try to answer them, bearing in mind that I'm not much of an expert on St. Patrick. This is chapter 8, and it's called Slane and Tara. Pardon me, not that long since I ate dinner. There you go, live broadcast, live TV and all that. The arrival of St. Patrick and his missioners in Ireland had not, we may be sure, been kept secret from the High King. And that is King Lera, who was son of Niall, Lera MacNeil, who reigned at the Hill of Tara. Long before their coming, indeed, so the old books relate, his druids who, quote, through their heathenish and idolatrous religion, had skill to know and foresee all things before they came to pass, unquote, had prophesied concerning them. And Marion is telling me she's in Austria. Thank you for that, Marion. A very good afternoon to you. Judy Strepp is saying, happy St. Patrick's Day. We enjoy your reading. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you are enjoying it. Fittingly enough, it was as a vested priest at the Mass altar that the figure of St. Patrick had been foreshadowed to them, and the ancient Irish verses in which they prophesied of him are still extant. Shaven head will come over the rough sea, and in some translations that's translated as adze head, for the adze, the bishop's hat. Hi again, Marion. Thanks for taking us out of this mad world from Wexford, Ireland. Hello, Maria. Oh, it's Maria. Sorry. Thank you. And a very happy St. Patrick's Day to you. And Martin Hughes is watching. Hi, Martin. How are you? Shaven head will come over the rough sea. His chasuble head hold, his staff crook-headed, his table at the east end of the house. All his people shall answer, Amen, Amen. And knowing that he should destroy the, quote, idols and impure things, unquote, they worshipped, and do away with the false religion of which they were the exponents, they tried to prejudice the High King against Christianity, describing it as a foreign religion, in the manner of a kingdom with strange doctrines brought from a long distance across the sea, proclaimed by a few, accepted by the many, and honoured by all, one that would overturn kingdoms, slay kings that resisted, lead away multitudes, destroy all their gods, and having cast down all the resources of their art, reign for ever and ever. Now, on the 25th of March each year, there was held at Tara a great assembly to mark the birthday of the year, the rebirth of vegetation. That in itself is very interesting, because essentially what that is saying is that there was already a sort of an Easter festival, a pagan or pre-Christian, prehistoric perhaps, festival at that time of the year, undoubtedly connected with the vernal equinox, which generally occurs on the 20th of March. And of course, this is a time of the year, well, we're approaching it now rapidly, when the day lengthens very noticeably. The month of March, we see an extension of the day of several hours of sunlight from the beginning of March to the end of March. And of course, that the vegetation starts to grow noticeably. This was a druid festival celebrated with many incantations and magical devices, and it gathered on the royal hill not only the chief ministers of druidism, but the kings, satraps, leaders, princes, and chief men of the people. One of the ceremonies was the striking forth of new fire, and there was an ordinance reinforced by the death penalty, that until the druid spark should be drawn by friction from the sacred wood on the royal heights of Tara, no fire must be kindled on any hearth in Éire. It is to be observed that this pagan custom of the Easter fire lit on top of mountains, the Easter Mountain, was general all over Europe as a ceremonial of the religion of nature worship, and signified the victory of spring over winter. It lasted on as a heathen survival in many places until as late as the 8th century, and many severe edicts were issued by church councils against these sacrilegious Easter fires. A more effective step was taken against them when the church adopted the ceremony into her own paschal ritual, cleansing the procedure of its pagan concept and giving it a Christian significance by referring it to the fiery column in the desert and to the resurrection of Christ. The new fire of the Christians on Holy Saturday is drawn from flint, signifying the resurrection of the light of the world from the tomb closed by a stone. Does that sound familiar? It happened in the year 433, this is 433 AD obviously, that Easter fell on the 26th of March. And for the celebration of it, St. Patrick chose the hill of Slane, which from the northern bank of the Boyne faces Tara, lying southward 10 miles away. And so just to put you in the picture, the village of Slane and the hill of Slane, if you could magically transport yourself out through my bookcase and through the wall there, is in that direction by a distance of about 7 or 8 miles. I don't know what that is, maybe 11 or 12 kilometres. Our saint had probably some special reason for his selection of Slane, though what it was does not transpire. That hill, which dominates the lovely plain of Bregia and commands one of the fairest and most extensive prospects in our land, had doubtless some historic connection which made it venerable for the Bregians. For Murchu, which is the old Irish name for Murphy, my own name, who describes it by its old name, the graves of the men of Fiach, Ferta Fer Fiach, speaks of an old story concerning the digging of these graves by the men, i.e. slaves, of Feckle Ferchertni, pardon me, who was one of the 9 great prophets of Breg. On that historic hill, then, I should point out at this point that the name Slane, yes, indeed, it had historic connotations and importance. The name Slane is derived from the fact that the Shanachus, which is the collection of place name stories about important and sacred places in Ireland, says that Slane is in fact the burial place of the Fir-Bolg king Slane, who was buried there. There is a mound, a moat, refashioned by the Normans, but undoubtedly a prehistoric burial mound, on the summit of the hill, shrouded by trees, which may yet turn out, through archaeological investigation, to be dated into the depths of prehistory. On that historic hill, then, Patrick and his companions pitched their tent and prepared to, quote, pay to the Most High God the due votive offerings of the Paschal feast and the sacrifice of praise with all devotion, unquote. That Easter, the first to be celebrated in Ireland by our apostle, was to be made memorable for the Christians of Meath by a very moving spectacle, the ordination of the first priest of their race, Saint Cianan of Duleek. Now, Duleek means Dowleig, from the old, it means old stone, and Duleek is about 4 miles in that direction. Okay, and the reason it's called Dowleig, old stone, is because it has the remains, allegedly, of the oldest stone church in Ireland. I've been there and I have photographed it, and perhaps later, when the broadcast is finished, I will share 1 or 2 of those photographs. It's only the ruins of a church now. Don't be expecting something with a roof on it. It's only, look, the low surviving walls. Where was I? Many catechumens too would there be gathered to receive in the Boyne the sacrament of baptism. Imagine, people were being baptised in the Boyne River by St. Patrick, and perhaps by St. Cianan of Duleek. For in the Easter celebrations, the administration of the solemn rite of baptism to the catechumens who had passed their scrutinies formed an integral and very important part. The ceremonies began by the striking forth from tinder of the new fire and the blessing of the Paschal candle. Then it would appear that a huge pyre, set ready for the purpose on the top of Slane, was lighted from the blessed flame by Cianan, who thereby kindled a fire which in era shall not be extinguished forever. Across the darkness of the March night, that Easter flame on Slane threw its challenge to Tara, which, still wrapped in pagan shadows, waited for the druid spark to be struck from the stubborn wood. The whole sky above Bregia brightened with illumination fairer than that of day. The Boyne rolled waves of gleaming light. The light of the world, in quotes, had indeed come forth from the stone sepulchre, and his rays fell lovely and sweet and pure on Virgin Ere to illuminate her until the end of time. You can see how the writing extols Patrick and the whole story. It is written entirely from the point of view of somebody who, is absolutely a believer in all this stuff. And for them, this is a moment of great glory. But, pardon me, excuse me. But when that light flamed through the darkness, there was wrath and fierce indignation in the breast of the High King and in the hearts of his druids. And the gathered nobles listened in dismay to the monarch's angry words. Who is it that has dared to do this impiety in my kingdom? Let him die the death. And all the nobles and elders made answer, We know not who has done this thing. Then the druids answered and said, O king, live forever. As for this fire which we behold, and which has been lighted up this night before one was lighted in thy house, that is, in the palace of Tara, unless it be put out on this night on which it has been lighted up, it will not be put out forever. Moreover, it will overcome all the fires of our religion, and he who kindled it, and the kingdom that will follow, from which it is kindled this night, will overcome both all of us, and thee too, and it will draw away all the men of thy kingdom, and all kingdoms will yield to it, and he will fill all things, and will reign forever. So there you go. They were already basically saying, if that fire doesn't get put out soon, then this new religion is going to take hold. The druids could see it coming. When Lera, the High King, heard these things, Moroku tells us, he was like Herod of old, sore troubled, and all the city of Tara with him. And he answered and said, It shall not be so, but now we will go that we may see the issue of the matter, and we shall take and slay those who do such an impiety against our kingdom. And so, having yoked 9 chariots in accordance with the tradition of the gods, and taking with him for the conflict those 2 druids who excelled all others, that is to say, Luchithmael and Lochru, Lera proceeded at the close of that night from Tara to the graves of the men of Feach, i.e. Slane, turning the faces of the men and horses left-hand-wise as they thought fitting. And Julianne Osborne is watching. Hello, Julianne. Very nice to see you, and a happy St. Patrick's Day to you. And thus, with druid ritual, with prancing horses and carved and painted chariots, and glittering harness, and the splendour of royalty and the pride of arms, the forces of druidism went forth that Easter vigil to answer the challenge of the light of the world. And as they went on their way, the druids said to the king, O king, thou must not go into the place where the fire is, lest perhaps thou do homage to him who kindled it. But thou must be outside it, near at hand, and let him be summoned to thee, that he may do homage and pledge his fealty to thee. And we and he shall parley with one another in thy presence, O king, and in this way thou shalt test us. And the High King answered and said, Good is your counsel, I will do as ye have said. Kathy Monk says, Hi Anthony, happy St. Patrick's Day. A very happy St. Patrick's Day to you, Kathy, and thanks for joining us. And when they arrived at the appointed place, they alighted from their chariots and horses, and they entered not into the enclosure of the place where the fire had been kindled, but took their seats close by. The tripartite, that's the tripartite life of St. Patrick, which in the main follows Moroku and the accounts of the incidents at Slane, has some picturesque details which seem to have come down from an eyewitness. It tells how when Patrick, summoned to the king's presence outside the enclosure of the Ferta, went forth chanting the verse, Some put their trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God. He found the warriors seated on the ground with the rims of their shields against their chins. For the druids had forbidden any of the king's party to pay the saint the courtesy of rising to their feet when he appeared. Only one among the nobles dared to break the druidical injunction. This was Urk MacDega, and he had his reward exceeding great, for Patrick's blessing there and then bestowed on him brought him the gift of faith. He joined the missioners, and, as he was a trained Olov in laws, was of great service to the mission in interpreting its relations with the Irish legal system, and eventually in adjusting the letter to the requirements of Christianity. He became, in after years, Bishop of Slane, and on that holy spot, where he first did reverence, to Patrick, he himself awaits the resurrection. And of course, the grave of St. Erc is to be readily pointed out in the old cemetery on the hill of Slane, and I have featured it in my videos, and I have some photographs of it. Two very sort of strange, almost triangular, pyramidal shaped stones mark the spot where he is said to be buried. When they had Patrick in the midst of their hostile company, the two druids made no long delay before entering on a disputation with him. The druid, second in importance, Lochru, began in a blustering and studiously offensive way. Then, says the tripartite, did he go astray into blaspheming the Trinity and the Catholic faith. Lee Trabal says, "Hi Anthony, happy St. Patrick's Day. My mother would be singing all round the house today in her Irish brogue if she was still with us." Ah, that'd be lovely. But sure, look, not to worry. And a very happy St. Patrick's Day to you. And Gordon Stewart has joined us. Gordon, I hope you're well distracted by radio, among other things. Patrick thereupon looked wrathfully upon him and cried out unto God with a loud voice, saying, "Lord, who canst do all things, and on whose power dependeth all that exists, and who hast sent us hither to preach thy name to the heathen, let this ungodly man, who blasphemeth thy name, be lifted up, and let him forthwith die." Hardly had he said these words when the druid was caught up into the air and forthwith cast down again, and his skull striking against a rock, his brains were scattered on the stone, and he was killed before their very eyes, and the heathen folk at the sight were adread. But in the heart of the High King, dread added to the anger already flaming there, and he would have his bodyguard slay the apostle where he stood. But Patrick cried out in a voice of clearness and power, "Let God arise, and let his enemies be scattered. Let them that hate him fly from before his face. Like as the smoke vanisheth, so let them vanish. Like as wax melteth at the fire, so let the ungodly perish at the presence of God." And at that strong prayer the very earth shook and trembled, and to the terrified onlookers the sky seemed to fall, and the maddened horses broke away, and the wind whirled the chariots through the fields, and there was a headlong flight over the great plain of Bregia, so that none remained in the presence of Patrick, but only the High King and his queen Angus, daughter of Tassach, daughter of Leohain, and two of their household. You'll have to forgive the dog. He gets rather excited. He's only 7 or 8 months old, and he gets barking very easily at the smallest things. Then the Queen, as a loving and faithful wife, approached the saint on bended knee, that the anger of heaven might be averted from her lord, and this was her prayer: "O just and mighty man, do not destroy the king, and the king shall come and kneel and worship thy lord." Under the impulse of fear, the king knelt down in Patrick's presence and reiterated the promise of accepting Christianity the queen had made for him. But he had no intention of keeping his promise, we are told, once the danger was past. On the contrary, he meditated a despicable act of treachery. He invited Patrick and his companions to follow him to Tara, promising to receive the faith in the presence of the men of Era there assembled. Deborah York, writer, is joining us and says, "Bonita York," and a very happy St. Patrick's Day to you. But he set an ambush on every path between Ferta Ferfeich and Tara, so that the saint and his company might perish on their way thither on the morrow. But God was watching over his own. The tripartite tells us how Patrick went with 8 young clerics, and Benin as a gillie with them, and Patrick gave them his blessing before they set out. A cloak of darkness went over them, so that not a man of them appeared. Howbeit the enemies who were waiting to ambush them saw 8 deer going past them, and behind them a fawn with a bundle on its back. That was Patrick with his 8, and Benin behind them with his tablets on his back. It was while he went unscathed through the hidden dangers that looked for him at the hostile king's command between Slane and Tara, that Patrick composed his famous Hymns of Invocation, the Hymn of Invocation, that Gaelic hymn called by some, from the circumstances of its composition, Féad Féada, the deer's cry. And that's very interesting, because that is the name of the cloak of invisibility that the Tuatha Dé Danann deity Manannán gifted his fellow deities with, so that they could be invisible to mortal eyes. And by others, so this is Féad Fiada, the deer's cry, and by others from its miraculous power to shield those who invoked God's aid by its verses, the lorica or shield of St. Patrick. It were well if all of us who glory in being St. Patrick's children knew the stirring words of that most mighty prayer. I bind myself today a strong virtue, an invocation of the Trinity. I believe in a threeness with confession of a oneness in the Creator of the universe. I bind to myself today the virtue of Christ's birth with his baptism, the virtue of his crucifixion with his burial, the virtue of his resurrection with his ascension, the virtue of his coming to the judgment of doom, the virtue of ranks of cherubim, obedience of angels, the service of archangels, hope of resurrection. And that ends the chapter about Slane, and here follows the chapter about Tara. Jacqueline Kennedy is watching again. Jacqueline, you're a regular, and I'm hoping that you're keeping in good spirits. A happy St. Patrick's Day to you, and I hope the artwork is coming along very well. On the following day, which was Easter Sunday, there was a great banquet in the Chech Michorta at Tara, the banqueting hall, to round off the celebrations inaugurated the previous evening. Murrachu tells us that the kings and princes and druids of all Ireland were feasted that day by the High King, for it was the chiefest of their festivals, while they drank the red wine of regal hospitality, whose lavish pouring was as the beat of surf upon the shore. They talked of the marvels of the day before and wondered what might follow them. Suddenly they saw Patrick and 5 of his companions standing in their midst. That was the greatest marvel they had yet witnessed, for the ponderous doors of the banqueting hall were bolted, and at the outworks of the royal hill guards had been set to challenge his passage. Yet here he stood in the royal presence, unchallenged by the guards. When our saint entered the Chach Michorta, the king's guests, mindful of the druid's proscription of the night before, refused him the courtesy of rising to greet his entrance. Only 2 people there did him that honour. That was Dovtak Macu Luger. Dovtak Macu Luger. Macu, I presume, is son of Luger. King poet of the island of Éire and of the king, says the tripartite, and a youthful poet of his household named Fiach. We should hear of Dovtak again, and of Fiach, and learn under what circumstances Fiach, afterwards Bishop of Sletty, was tonsured by St. Patrick. Dovtak, we are told, both by Murrachu and the tripartite, was the first convert Patrick made on Tara that day, and Patrick bestowed a blessing on him and on his offspring. The High King, mindful of his promises on the hill of Slane, received the saint with a certain show of courtesy. He invited him to his own couch, and having set him in the place of honour, ordered food and drink to be placed before him. Patrick received these civilities in a most gracious manner, though he knew perfectly well how little goodwill was behind them. That was soon made evident when, apparently with the High King's knowledge, the druid Luctamail, wishing to avenge the death of his brother druid Lochru at Slane the night before, tried to kill the saint by putting a drop of powerful poison in his cup while he was not looking. But Patrick knew what had happened. He blessed the cup, and the liquid in it congealed. Then he turned the vessel upside down, and the drop the druid had put into it fell out, leaving only the original contents, which, being blessed again by the saint, became fluid once more. The druid, feeling that he had been worsted in this preliminary encounter, thereupon proposed a contest of miracles on the plain in sight of the multitude. It was the challenge of the powers of darkness, with their limited and malicious control over the forces of nature, to the power of Almighty God, the Creator and Sovereign Lord of heaven and earth. That day God made Patrick the garant of his power, so that it might be made manifest to the men and women of Éire, gathered on Tara's royal heights, and both Murrachu and Tírechain and the tripartite have pictured the contest between the two religions, struggling that Easter Sunday for the possession of Éire with a dramatic force which makes their readers feel as if we ourselves were among the awed thousands of eyewitnesses, the hosts biding without Tara in the plain. After the trial of the cup, the druids said, "Let us work miracles on this great plain." And Patrick answered and said, "What miracles?" The druid answered, "Let us bring snow upon the earth." Then Patrick said, "I do not wish to bring things that are contrary to the will of God." And the druid said, "I will bring it in the sight of all." Then he began his magical incantations and brought down snow over the whole plain to the depths of a man's waist, and all saw it and marvelled. And St. Patrick said, "Lo, we see this thing, now take it away." But the other replied, "I cannot take it away till this time tomorrow." Then the saint said, "Able art thou to do evil, but not good. I am not of that sort." Thereupon he blessed the whole plain round about, and the snow vanished quicker than a word could be uttered, without any rain or cloud or wind. And the multitude shouted aloud and marvelled greatly. And a little after this, the magician invoked his demons and brought upon the earth a very thick darkness as a miracle, and all murmured at it. The saint said, "Drive away the darkness." But he could not in this case either. St. Patrick, however, prayed and uttered a blessing, and suddenly the darkness was driven away, and the sun shone forth, and all shouted aloud and gave thanks. Now when all these things had been done by the magician and Patrick in the sight of the king said to them, "Throw your books into water, and we shall honour him whose books come out unharmed." Catherine McManus says hi, thank you. Very happy St. Patrick's Day to you, Catherine. Thanks for joining us. Laura Coates is watching. Hello, Laura. Haven't seen you in a long time. Hope you're keeping well, and I hope you're having a nice St. Patrick's Day. I'm just going to make a slight adjustment to this phone because it just seems to be tilting over. I just want to be careful that it doesn't fall. Patrick replied, "I will do it." But the druid protested, "I do not wish to enter into a trial by water with this fellow, for water is his god." He had evidently heard of baptism by water given by Patrick. And the king answered and said, "Throw them into fire." And Patrick said, "I am ready." But the druid, being unwilling, said, "This man worships as his god water and fire turn about every alternate year." And the saint said, "That is not so, but thou thyself shalt go, and one of my lads shall go with thee into a house separated and shut up, and my garment shall be around thee, and thy garment around him, and fire shall be set to the house, and the judgment of the Most High invoked by this ordeal." At this point, the tripartite, which hitherto follows Murrachu with great exactness, adds a touching and very appealing detail, which brings on the stage set for these great happenings a group of dear Irish boys. These little princes, who were at the court of the High King as hostages for their fathers, hence the Dún O'Neill, the Mound of the Hostages, the idea of keeping hostages of the sons of kings from kingdoms round about as a sort of a security against the attack of those kings against your kingdom. Sorry, where was I? These little princes who were at the court of the High King as hostages for their fathers had been, as we might expect, deeply interested spectators of the wonderful events of that memorable Easter Sunday. Kirsten Salisbury says, "I'd love to hear the Druids' version of this story." And of course, yes, Kirsten, history is written by the victor, they do say. It would be nice to get both sides of the story. Now, when the ordeal of fire had been proposed, they were doubly interested, inasmuch as young Benin, who was doubtless about their own age, had been selected as Patrick's representative in it. They therefore followed with a keen scrutiny the preparations made for the staging of the ordeal, and having discovered that an act of treachery was being planned, they came in tears to tell Patrick to tell him of it. Then came to Patrick the 3 children who were biding in hostageship with Léire. They weep to Patrick. "What is the matter?" asked the saint. A prince's troth, they answered, hath been broken in the chief city of the Gael. That is to say, the house that is a building for the druid and thy gilly. Thus it is a building half of green wood and half of dry, and it is in the half made of dry wood thy gilly is to be put. So it was done. So was it done. The druid with Patrick's chasuble. What is that word? Chasuble. I don't know that word. The druid with Patrick's chasuble around him was put into the greenwood. Oh yeah, that's the sacred garment, isn't it? The vestment or the cloak. And young Benin vested in the druid's tunic in the dry. The door was bolted from the outside, and fire was set to it. And it came to pass in that hour that as Patrick prayed, the flame of the fire burnt up the druid with the half of the house that was made of green wood, the cloak of Patrick alone remaining unscathed. Benin, on the other hand, in the dry half, was neither touched by the fire nor the least alarmed. Only the cloak of the druid, which was around him, was, by the will of God, burnt up. The effect of these stupendous miracles on the people was instantaneous, but the reaction of the High King to them is less evident. Muraku indeed states that, after a fierce outburst of anger against the saint, caused by the death of his druid, he took counsel with his elders and all his senate, and arrived at the somewhat interested conclusion, expressed in the formula, "It is better for me to believe than to die." And after taking counsel, says Muraku, he believed on that day, by the advice of his friends, and turned to the everlasting Lord God of Israel, and there many others believed as well. Tira Khan, on the other hand, expressly states that the most Lyra did for Patrick was to give him a safe conduct through his kingdom, and allow him to propagate the Christian religion unopposed. But for himself, old pagan ideas of loyalty to ancestral beliefs, of unrelenting hostility towards ancestral foes, forbade him to accept the Christian teachings of charity and forgiveness. But he himself could not believe, saying, "For Niall, my father, forbade me to believe," commanding me rather to be buried on the ramparts of Tara as men stand up in battle. For the Gentiles are wont to be buried in their sepulchres fully armed, with weapons ready facing the foe, until the day of Erdaha, as the Druids call it, that is, the day of judgment of the Lord. Thus must I, the son of Niall, be buried, even as the son of Dunlang is buried at Moshtin, because of the endurance of our enmity. And that is from the Book of Armagh. And that is the story of Patrick's coming to Slane and Tara, as retold by Evelyn Concannon in St. Patrick, His Life and Mission. Now, many of you will be wondering about the legends associated with Patrick and the things that he is said to have done. One, by demonstrating the Holy Trinity to the people by showing them a shamrock, a three-leafed plant, using it to illustrate the Christian teaching of three persons in one God. That story first appears in written form in the 18th century, actually in 1726, although it's probably older, and the shamrock, of course, has become the symbol of St. Patrick and is worn by everybody at the festivities. Well, generally, not today, unfortunately, because the parades are not happening today due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And that's very interesting because, you know, it echoes in a way the triple spiral on the front of the entrance stone at Newgrange, Sheedon Broga, which may represent, I have speculated in my written work, the prehistoric Neolithic divinity triad, that is Dagda, Boyne and Angus Og, or if you prefer a later and slightly different telling of the tale, Lu and Dectine, my apologies, and Setanta, who later become Cuchulainn. Is everybody still hearing me? Patricia is saying she's having trouble. That's back. Okay, that's good. That's good. In terms of Patrick's banishment of the snakes, something very interesting came up in discussion this morning. I was doing I'm just trying to find it here so I can briefly refer to the title of it. I was doing an interview with Emer on the Being Celtic podcast, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Times, Emer Stassen. And there's a link further down the Facebook page. And that came up in discussion as to what the snakes might have represented. Something that struck me afterwards that I should have mentioned at the time is something that I'm about to mention. Patrick was credited with banishing snakes from Ireland. The difficulty with that is that we know scientifically as fact that there never were any snakes in Ireland. There never were any real snakes in Ireland, so people have wondered what did the snakes represent. Did they represent the pagans, the druids, those who practiced heathenism, bearing in mind that in the Bible, the snake represented, the serpent represented Satan or the devil or evil. The snake that jumps up and bites the horse heels so that its rider falls backwards. The absence of snakes in Ireland has been noted from as long ago as the 3rd century by Gaius Julius Solanus, but of course later legend has attributed the banishment of snakes to Patrick. The earliest text to mention an Irish saint banishing snakes from Ireland is in fact the life of Saint Columba, written in the late 7th or early 8th century. The earliest written record of a legend about Patrick ridding Ireland of venomous creatures date to the 13th century by Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, who expressed scepticism about the veracity of the story. And of course we should express scepticism about the veracity of everything that Geraldus wrote, given that he was an Anglo-Norman propagandist. The snakes were apparently driven into the sea by Patrick after they attacked him during a 40-day fast he was undertaking at the top of a hill. Now, if you read the stories or the legends about Patrick, he was fasting on the top of Crochan Aigla, the mountain in the west, which we know more commonly today as Croagh Patrick. Now, if you actually read the different versions, it's not always snakes that attack him. In one version, it's the demon birds, and I mentioned this in Island of the Setting Sun. It's not always snakes. But interesting in this regard is the fact that while there were never any snakes in Ireland, there were legends of great snake-like, serpent-like creatures. So, for instance, some legends describe the Ulfecht, the Kiranach, or the Copog Porrig. Now, the Ulfecht is a slightly altered version of a monster that we encounter, or a great serpent that we encounter in the ancient mythology of the Boyne Valley, called the Mata. And you might have heard me referencing the Mata both online and in my printed work. This is a story contained in the Dunshanicus, which says that the Mata was a giant. It doesn't actually use the word snake. It's variously described as a monster with 100 legs and 4 heads, like a sort of a hydra, a great water snake of some kind. It licks up the Boyne until the river becomes a dry valley. And it is brought to a mysterious stone at Newgrange called a Leckben, and is hacked apart. It is dismembered and chopped up by the men of Erin, or depending on the version that you read, the men of Ulster, or the god, the deity, the Dagda, the chief of the deities, and the owner and builder of Newgrange. The Dagda apparently killed the monster with his club, and caused the flood waters to recede. And I'm interested in this regard because I'm just wondering whether, in fact, the mythology and the legend around Patrick and the snakes isn't somehow derived from pre-Christian mythology about the victory of the sun god over a serpent, and one causing a difficulty with the deprivation of water. Especially so given that Patrick was supposed to have driven the snakes into the sea. This is very interesting. Now, one could ask the question, how far back does this story of the Mata go in relation to the Boyne? It's a creation myth, It was first written down in the Dinshanachus. Versions of that are found in the 12th century Book of Leinster, among other ancient manuscripts. Who knows is the answer, because once you go back prior to the written versions of myths, which were all written down, mostly written down in the Christian monasteries of medieval Ireland, beginning in the 11th century up until the 16th century, it's very difficult to say how far back it goes. I believe it to be truly very, very ancient. Kieran Skinny Stewart refers to Crum here, and of course Crum was the one, was sort of like, wasn't he the dark aspect of the solar deity who Patrick may have battled with? And Downach Crum Cruach was the festival celebrated at Croagh Patrick prior to the introduction of Christianity, and of course it became Reek Sunday, definitively set and in honour of St. Patrick from that time onwards. There's also another collection of stories in the 12th century called Achaló no Shonórach, which is the colloquy of the ancients, in which St. Patrick is met by two ancient warriors, Coilche mac Ronan and Oisin, during his evangelical travels. The two were once members of Fionn McCool's warrior band, the Fianna, and somehow survived into St. Patrick's time. In the work, St. Patrick seeks to convert the warriors to Christianity while they defend their Christian past. The heroic pagan lifestyle of the warriors, of fighting and feasting and living close to nature, is contrasted with the more peaceful but unheroic and non-sensual life offered by Christianity. And of course, interesting in this regard, in relation to the whole discussion about Patrick and Christianity, and the whole idea that Christianity destroyed pagan culture. It didn't destroy it. In fact, what happened was that there was a synthesis. It incorporated many aspects of that culture into the new religion, which became known, or was referred to by modern scholars as Celtic Christianity or Irish Christianity. And for a couple of centuries after Patrick's arrival, the Irish Church celebrated Easter upon a date that differed from the celebration of the Church in Rome, and that was a discord, that was a dispute between the early Irish Church and the Roman Church that lasted for, I'm not sure exactly how long. It might have been a century and a half, it might have been 2 centuries. Until eventually the Irish Church was put in order. Now, part of the reason for that was that get my thoughts together here, was that, of course, at this time the Roman Empire was crumbling, and whatever influence Rome had upon its empire, and the church had upon its own organisation, was dwindling, and things were in flux. So very much in regard to Patrick, as I said, the known facts, it has been suggested, about his life could be written on the back of a postage stamp, but the lore and mythology and stories around him would fill many volumes. And I'm just going to read a very short passage from this is again written by somebody. Well, this is written by a cleric, Mary Frances Cusack. This is a popular illustrated history of Ireland from AD 400 to 1800, published originally by Mary Frances Cusack, who was known as the Nun of Kenmare, and first published in 1868. Is it Caitlin or Cochleen? I think it's Caitlin. Caitlin, are we going to talk about Sheila tomorrow? I am going to do my very best to talk about Sheila tomorrow. The reason I say I'm going to do my very best is that there isn't a huge amount of information about her. I will gather what I can and we'll see where the discussion goes. But yes, it is absolutely my intention to talk about St. Patrick's wife, Sheila. I know Patrick had a wife, apparently. Erin Durrett. It's a shame for Christianity that the Celtic Irish Church was brought in line by the Roman Church. The Irish Church was closer to the people and much less hierarchical. And that, indeed, Erin, may be one of the reasons why it thrived in the centuries immediately following St. Patrick's arrival. So this is another very brief retelling of the tale, worth reading it from another source. And this is the Nun of Kenmare, Mary Frances Cusack. On Holy Saturday, St. Patrick arrived at Slane, where he caused a tent to be erected and lighted the paschal fire at nightfall, preparatory to the celebration of the Easter festival. The princes and chieftains of Meath were at the same time assembled at Tara, where King Leire was holding a great pagan festival. By the way, I very, very rarely use the word pagan in my work, because pagan to me, well, actually, the word doesn't it mean a country person, a simple country person. It doesn't, it's used in a denigratory fashion to describe anything that is pre-Christian, anything that goes against the doctrine of Christianity. So I don't use it. I tend to talk in terms of prehistoric, pre-Christian, early Irish. Iron Age if necessary, define the age in which it was set. But I do my best to avoid the use of the word pagan, because of the connotations associated with it. The object of this meeting has been disputed. Some authorities saying that it was convoked to celebrate the Beltane, or Fire of Baal, or Baal, B-A-L-L. I don't believe that, because Beltane is in May. It's a later festival. It's cross-quarter festival. It's got nothing to do with the celebration of Easter and equinox. On the festival of Beltane, it was forbidden to light any fire until a flame was visible from the top of the hill of Tara. Leire was indignant that this regulation should have been infringed, and probably the representation of his druids regarding the mission of the great apostle did not tend to allay his wrath. Determined to examine himself into the intention of these bold strangers, he set forth, accompanied by his bards and attendants, to the place where the sacred fire had been kindled, and ordered the apostle to be brought before him, strictly commanding at the same time that no respect should be shown to him. And it's very interesting that although it talks about Tara as the setting for the king, and it briefly mentions Slane, it's almost as if the places are irrelevant to the tale, and the places are not at all irrelevant to the tale, because in the second edition of Island of the Setting Sun in Search of Ireland's Ancient Astronomers, which was printed in 2008 and is due to be reissued this year if we get out of this situation with the COVID-19 virus, hopefully all going well, Island of the Setting Sun will be republished. I spoke about a sacred alignment that is undoubtedly originally a prehistoric alignment of sites, stretching all the way from the Curragh Plain in Kildare to St Bridget's Well at Fort in Dundalk. Now, this alignment of sites crosses directly through the Mound of the Hostages at Slane and Dua Slane, the burial mound of King Slane on the peak of the hill of Slane. It also passes through a prehistoric Bronze Age barrow cemetery at Mount Ordeals in County Louth, and other places, including a moated mound at Thurstonstown near Bow Park in County Meath. In addition to this, there's another alignment that stretches from the Mill Mount in Drogheda through the hill of Slane all the way to the west to exactly the church on the peak of Croagh an Aigla, or Croagh Patrick. Now, I know that alignments of sites are disputed, and in fact it is true that if you set down a map of Ireland and get a ruler and draw a line from one side of Ireland to the other, it will undoubtedly cross through several ancient sites on the way. That's not in dispute. What's interesting about this is that when you're at Millmount in Drogheda, which is a prehistoric burial mound with a Norman, which was reconstructed or reinforced by the Normans, with a British military fort built on it in the early 1800s, that is reputed in local lore to be the burial place of Aurgine or Amergin, the Milesian bard or poet, that when you're standing there on the equinoxes, or roughly at the time of the equinoxes, a few days before, isn't it? A few days after vernal equinox and a few days before autumnal equinox, that the sun is seen to set into Dua Slane on the hill of Slane from the Millmount in Drogheda. Now, there is no immediate connection between the Millmount and St. Patrick, but Patrick landed in exactly the same place in the Boyne estuary as Aurgine was said to have done in Lower Gawala, placing his foot on the shore of the Boyne. So I'm assuming that while there is a connection in the local lore with Aurgine and the mount that we call Millmount, interesting, Millmount, son of Meal, perhaps. Also, it had a windmill on it at some point, so that may be a more prosaic explanation for its name. That Millmount occupies a sort of a very commanding position overlooking the River Boyne and the estuary of the Boyne. And so if Patrick was coming, I meant to say this at the very beginning of the broadcast, Patrick was coming to proclaim Christianity into Ireland, and he chose the very best place to do it. Okay, Slane, with its eminence and being visible from all around, had a commanding view of the ancient monument complex of Brunabonia. You can see Nouth, Douth and Newgrange from Slane, and therefore anything that's happening at Slane in terms of a sacred fire is visible not only from Tara, 10 miles to the south or southwest, but also from the great cemetery or the great monument complex of Brunabonia. So he was making, I think, a very symbolic statement, which was, I am going to pronounce this new religion at the very heart of the old religion, the place where the ancient deities and ancestors are worshipped at Brunabonia. So he chose the location very cleverly. He arrived and set foot on the Boyne a little bit like Aurigeen did, and Aurigeen's arrival is related, of course, in Lower Gawala, the Book of the Takings of Ireland, commonly known as the Book of Invasions. In other words, that you could to a certain extent, you could view the arrival of St. Patrick as the equivalent of an invasion, couldn't you? You know, Esther Guggisberg is watching. Hello, Anthony, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. Very good to have you along, Esther, as usual. Thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking about Patrick and his lighting of the Paschal fire at Slane, and his battle with the king and the druids of Tara, and his bringing of Christianity to Ireland, and some of the other aspects involved in his story. Much later on, well, I'm not sure in terms of where we can place this tale, but much later on, Patrick enters another story concerning Sheedenbroga or Newgrange, which is one of the stories that I mentioned yesterday, or the day before, should I say, in relation to Dagda. That if you're reading about Newgrange and you want source material, source mythological material, you would need to refer to the Dinshanachus and, of course, the Lower Gawala, but principally in relation to Newgrange and the deities of Newgrange, you would refer to Tuchmark, Etain, the wooing of Etain, the Gawal in Shida, the distribution of the fairy mounds or the otherworld mounds, and a story called Altram Chia Ga Water, which translates as the fosterage of the house of the two drinking vessels. A long-winded title, I think you'll agree. But in that story, there is basically, there are two ladies involved in the story, two female characters, Corcog and Ethna, who are the daughters of the steward of the brew, and a daughter of Elkmar, I believe, isn't it? And Ethna stops eating the Tuatha Dé Danann food, and suddenly she is no longer visible to them, and she becomes visible to the Christians, and she's basically brought over to the other side, if you wanted to put it that way. After that lay, the cleric prayed the Lord that Patrick should come to help and succour him, for fear the maiden should be taken from him against his will. And the Lord granted the cleric his pious request, so that it was at one time Patrick and his clerics came to the door of the oratory, and Angus to the other side of the river. That's Angus Machon Og, the youthful son who took over Newgrange, or Sheon Vrew Sheedenbroga, from his father the Dagda. Then Patrick asked the cleric who the maiden was, and a conversation took place between him and Angus about her, and Angus asked, "Will you let my foster child come to me, cleric?" "She is not a foster child of yours at all," said Patrick, "but of the god of the elements, though you fostered her for a time." "I am like to rob you of the maiden," said Angus, "if I thought it would benefit me." "The strength and power of the Lord from me against you," said Patrick, "and if you were to act on my advice, Angus," said he, "I should not be against you about every just thing." "What is that?" said Angus. "To worship the true Almighty God, and to shun vain gods, and to be baptized in the name of the Trinity, and to change your name, and to part you from punishments." And Cynthia Fallon is saying hello from Colorado. Very day to you, Cynthia. Very nice of you to join us. I hope you're having a good day. Oh, sorry, my phone's ringing. I need to decline that. I will ring that person back. Sorry, my watch is buzzing also. That is not the cause for which we came from our house, said Angus. I just want to make sure that that's the next page. And this is from Altram Chia Gawater. Angus spurred his steed from the river then, and goes back gloomily, sadly, and left his foster child, though he was loath. And he said this lay, let us turn away in trouble from fair white, beautiful Ethna. By the way, in some threads of mythology, Ethna is another name for Boyne, the goddess, after whom Brunobonia is named. Marie Hughes, thank you. An informative and entertaining pleasure today. Good stuff. Dean Mac... I don't know how to pronounce your surname. Cowell. What is that? McCowell, is it? Keep up the good work from Belfast. Thank you, Dean. I hope you're having a good St. Patrick's Day. Let us turn away in trouble from fair, white, beautiful Ethna, the bright, gentle, frail swan, very interesting, whom I used ever to protect. Though you are a foster sister, Kirkhogue is not good for guarding. My love for the heroic, generous one I shall let go. Let us utter 3 heavy cries, lamenting the foster child of the brew. I am, after my rosy, fair one, like a man after his wounding. Ethna I will not follow from this on till the living judgment. Victorious gave. My name is not proud Angus. And there are sections of this missing. And her being carried off by force. Let us depart, O host of the land of promise. But though grievous to us, let us do it. Sad to me the coming of this Tilgin into this land, we will conceal it not, to go away from the one I leave, but though it is difficult, let us do it. And of course, basically what has happened is that St. Patrick has won a victory over the pagan Angus, and he has managed to bring Ethna under the fold of Christianity and away from her pagan ancestry. Bonnie Denny is saying hello from St. Paul in Maine. And a very good afternoon to you, Bonnie, and a happy St. Patrick's Day to you. And one wonders if one could extract what is undoubtedly the pre-Christian kernel of the myth contained in Altram Chia Gawater. And that translation, by the way, is by Lillian Duncan. You know that this is a story, I reckon, that pertains to Sheedan Broga, but which has been interfered with, corrupted, dissected, changed by Christian scribes to basically make Angus and his buddies seem like heathen pagans, and to paint Patrick and his apostles and his followers in a good light, obviously. Anyway, there at the moment is the stories of, or are the stories of St. Patrick and his arrival into the Boyne Valley. There is lots of material there about Patrick, and there's lots of scholarly material about Patrick. Available quite freely on the internet are the old translations of the tripartite life and Muraku's life of Patrick. So it's not difficult to get information about Patrick if you so wish. For me, I'm going to leave it at that and to say thank you all for joining us again. Hoping to do this every day. We're expecting very quickly this week to go into a full lockdown. We already have quite serious restrictions in terms of gatherings, and we're being told to stay apart as much as possible. All schools and colleges are closed. A lot of people are working from home. A lot of people have lost their jobs, unfortunately. Hopefully people can keep the spirit, and as community we're stronger than we are as individuals, and we'll all get through this, fingers crossed. And hopefully they will find an effective treatment and or a vaccine very, very quickly, so that we can conquer this great illness which has afflicted the world. In the meantime, I'm hoping to keep bringing these stories to you to try and cheer you up, and so that you're not too downhearted and anxious in the current climate. Claire Gaynard says, love this, thank you. Do you talk on the Tua de Danann? Hope so. Well, yes, and indeed, if you go to the link that I shared, the Mythical Ireland blog, I'll paste it in again under this as another message. I'll reply to your message if I can No, I can't, so I'll just put it in as a message. There's a link there to all the previous episodes. Episode 1 was about the Tuatha De Danann, and of course the episode 4, which is about the Dagda, was also about the Tuatha De Danann. So there'll be plenty of mentions of the Tuatha De Danann, don't worry about that. Who else? Catherine Woodruff is in Wisconsin. Good to find you all here again. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and a lot of people sharing what looks like a 4-leafed clover. That is not a shamrock. Shamrock has 3 leaves. Kieran Skinny Stewart says, thanks, Anthony. Well, thanks for joining us, Kieran. Good of you to drop in. Tatiana says, thank you. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. And the very same to you. Catherine Wall McManus, thanks, Anthony. You're very welcome, Catherine. Lisa Kelly, I won't try to pronounce your surname, says, hello. Thank you from New Jersey. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Well, I was in Princeton in New Jersey last November, and I would love to go back to the States. At the moment, it doesn't look like it's going to be possible for a while. But look, let's keep the fingers crossed, and let's hope that there's good news sooner rather than later. Don't forget that the video of this, if you've just joined us or you've missed any of it, the video will be made available on Facebook immediately afterwards. Well, it might take a few minutes to render. And also, I'll upload a version of it to the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mythical Ireland. Tomorrow, it would be my intention to deal, certainly for part of tomorrow's live broadcast, with Sheila. She who is popularly said in pre-famine folklore to have been the wife of St. Patrick. I know, rather controversial. But join us tomorrow for more live chat. In the meantime, there's lots of other stuff that you can be reading. Even if you haven't got access to books, go to mythicalireland.com. There's lots of material on the website there. If you're on Facebook, definitely go to, well, you're on the page here if you're watching this. But if you're watching this video afterwards, come to the Mythical Ireland Facebook page. Lots and lots of photographs and information and videos and podcasts shared on there. And if you're lucky enough to have a library as vast as mine, which is 700 books and counting, I've got lots of stuff here to keep me occupied during the lock-in, as it were. All the very best to you all. I wish you all the best greetings of St. Patrick's Day. All good wishes from the Tuatha De Danann and all the ancestors and the ancient deities of Ireland, and all those who we cherish, to give upon you every blessing and every good hope, and to keep your spirits up in the current situation, and to know that we'll get through it. May Ireland and Patrick and everyone involved in the stories today bless us abundantly, and we'll see you all tomorrow.